Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to our Partners in Confinement series. This is a collaboration between the Marin Poetry Center and the Mill Valley Library. And I am Meryl Natchez, the events chair for Marin Poetry Center. And I'm just so excited to have Robert Hass and Brenda Hillman as the first couple to be the first partners in this series. I think we couldn't have had a better cook-off. And I had no idea when I thought up this series that we would be hosting such an incredibly rich and diverse group of literary couples. Coming up after this, we have Cornelius Eady and Sarah Micklem, and then Major and Dee Dee Jackson, and then Patricia Smith and Bruce De Silva. So you can check out the Marin Poetry Center website or the Mill Valley Library website for details on upcoming shows, because this one's going to be so terrific. I'm sure you're going to want to watch the others. I really have to give a huge thanks to Mill Valley Library for hosting this event, especially the city librarian, Angie Brenner. She makes this whole collaboration possible. And Franklin Walther manages the technology. And I've worked with a lot of people managing technology in my career. And I have to say that Franklin displays unusual skill and graciousness. So we're really grateful to him. The format for tonight's event is largely a conversation between these two poets. You can read their bios in the chat, and that's where you can post your questions too. It's not going to be interactive, but after 20 or 30 minutes, I will be watching the Q&A, and I'll kind of break in at some point and ask a few questions. If there's a whole lot of questions, I'm just going to be able to select a few because we want to keep this event to about 45 minutes. So I think that's the whole introduction that I've got. So Bob and Brenda, I think it's your turn to get started.
Well, thank you, Meryl. How to get started? I said to Brenda that this reminds me, there were, I think it was in the 70s, a kind of television show in which they would get couples independently of each other to describe how they met. And then they would show the two completely divergent versions of the story. So I don't know how to begin to talk about being couples in confinement, except for me to say it's very entertaining being in confinement with Brenda Hillman. Should we describe your days?
We don't want to talk about how we met, although our anniversary is coming up in a little bit. I think where the idea of this series, thank you, Meryl, thank you to the Marin Poetry Center and definitely to the Mill Valley Library in Franklin. We were thinking about our different styles of being in this experience and how intense it's been, and talking a little bit about it over the last couple of weeks as we were thinking of what to share with you and what would be useful to you all as readers and writers. And Meryl was asking us how our different experiences of being in shelter might compare. I'm intensely introverted, and so going into a space where I had to be indoors a lot and not travel as much as I usually do and not go out as much has been actually not, that part of it hasn't been a strain at all. Being in Bob's company has been a joy in that Bob is incredibly interesting. All of his sentences are different, every single one of them. And so that's a delight and a pleasure. And just knowing that you're sharing something that's astonishingly difficult and history making and strange and intense and violent and profound, surrounded by incredible physical beauty that we have in this state, has been an odd thing. But yeah, and we'll say something about our writing, I think, in a minute. But I don't know. What about you?
Well, I mean, well, for me personally, that I retired from teaching as of last September, I guess. And so the business of staying in place and the business of suddenly not having that set of obligations, it's hard for me to sort out one from the other. The other thing, of course, is that we've all gone through a wave of at least three things. One is the pandemic and not knowing what's coming. And then there was the police murder of George Floyd and the demonstrations that came out of that as another wave of this last few months. And then the third one is just the incredible, to have incredible incompetence of the federal government. And with the upcoming election is like a third set of surges that we're having to navigate and think what to do about. So there's, what the hell do we do with ourselves? Writers and artists, in some ways, great. We don't have to go out. We can sit around and read and write. Great. And in both our cases, Brenda was still teaching. I did a little bit of teaching and I had book writings to do, but still we were relatively free. A lot of people are struggling and suffering. So there's that. Then privileged white people, what do we do about this? That murder made clear, echoing a series of other ones, that we couldn't just sit around and do nothing. And then there's, how do you respond to the electoral season that we're in? So a lot of stuff going on.
And also the disconnect between the 30 million people out of work and the fact that we do have jobs, and in Bob's case, retired, and the sense that, responsibility for thinking, as C.D. Wright says, we're one with others, where we aren't our solitary selves, even though we're sequestered. And so all of these things. Early in the time, in March, Bob and I took an online course on the Book of Revelation, because our little local parish here, we're out in West Marin right now, and our little local parish was offering this thing about the Book of Revelation and the Apocalypse, and we got very interested in the idea of apocalypse in literature. And so that has entered a lot of my work, just thinking about waves of apocalypse and apocalyptic thinking, and waves of history, both linear and cyclical, and that has really affected my writing, and sort of a series of poems that I'm working on. And Bob's.
That's interesting, partly as a difference. I thought it would be fun to take this course and to read this book, and everybody should read it at some point. It's quite amazing, this thing written probably in about the year 100, which I found completely repellent. It made me swear to anti-apocalyptic ways of thinking, I think. This imagery, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, has haunted the human imagination for 2,000 years. So it's a powerful piece of writing.
And all the entrances of the candlesticks and the beasts and all the colors and the various kinds of horns on the creatures.
And the seven seals. You're going to break the seven seals.
Yeah, and all these moments of the silences coming in 30-minute segments. And I found it a complete Gnostic turn on. And so it entered my poetry in full force. And not that it's amusing. For me, it's a fantastic set of imagery that circulates throughout history, and certainly in in surrealist literature and in Ginsberg and so on. And I do a lot of trance work and meditation and enter the spirit world and things like that. And so it completely fit in with my poetic and spiritual practice. So that was one thing that happened. Should we read a poem?
Why don't you read a poem?
Do you want me to read one of mine or yours?
Read one of yours.
Okay, all right.
You think she should read?
I'll start with. I'll read the first one that I wrote in that series, and it's what Alice Quinn is putting together an anthology called "Together in a Sudden Strangeness," and it's a collection of poems that were written during the immediate onset of the pandemic. A ragged white moth passes by. Had no first line, and the epic was museless except for one elderly moth flying through as the spirit of history. The sickness was also flying through, though it was not alive. When would they meet? And when we thought of the world soul, how should distances apply? Past papered windows of locked up cafes, the quartz in the desert, and the fabled silicon mind meld. Past the uninsured. Mosses on buildings looked like themselves, crowded but separate. Social cell walls and stems, each with a certain commitment to survive. I, a poet on the island of a thought, with love nearby, lit a candle throughout spring. On and on the little beasts visited. No 666 for them. The rat and bacteria and sparrow's gold corona. The ragged white moth of history flew over landfills and the anti-sorrow of the flat few. 2 wings, 6 legs, or 4 wings, depending. Flew with the M of our minds or the missing ones, its faraway moth babies in the drawers, quietly eating the sweaters of our mothers. And the jeweled threads of the protein wove the sickness, looking like life or death, though truly it was neither. And parallel to that, in the green springing hills, the grace-footed, dark-haired spirit of the will not end. I borrowed a line from a friend, David Robson, who works in computer industry, and he provided the fabled silicon mind meld. And so I thank him for that line. You read one.
The trouble with this for me is that I don't like anything I've written about this subject, and especially don't like reading it after Brenda. So one of my first thoughts about it after about a month of the pandemic was, this is great. Everybody, we ought to just every year have a month off, have Congress pass a bill and pay everybody what they would normally make, but just stay home. And
oh, a bird just hit our window.
Wow. We're looking out to a place where the deer and the foxes often come by. So anyway, this is called Walking in the Neighborhood. It was I couldn't go to the gym, so I'd take a walk every morning. And from our hillside, I'd look out and I'd see San Francisco Bay and the city, and there were no people. And I thought, what is a street? Brenda immediately goes into a magical inner world. I go into my boring literalness. Anyway, walking in the neighborhood, blue of the sky, blue of the bay, deep blue-green of the mountain and the city across the bay, gleaming in the morning sun. The streets are empty. So the first thing to notice is what a street is. Road bed, 2 gutters, 2 curbs, a planting strip, sidewalks on either side. I just noticed paths lead to doors. Stairs are vertical paths. Driveways are car paths. People paint doors to the lives they are waking to, various colors, red, green, brown. 2 crows fly by with twigs in their beaks. It's April, they're nesting. And then down the street, another human being appears. I am wearing a red bandana, like a train robber in an old Western. She is wearing a surgeon's mask and gloves. I move into the street and say, good morning. She says, 40,000 dead and counting. A gold-crowned sparrow, they pass through this time of year, perches on the tip of the gable of a house and issues one sweet, plaintive note. Blue of the sky, blue of the bay, deep blue-gray of the mountain. In the distance, the white city, a still life of the made world, immaculate, replete, where people are living their lives or where their lives are living them. Anyway, not thrilling to me.
I love the fact that Bob can go into anything and any place and make it sound vast and fascinating. So I wanted to say, because Meryl had asked us earlier what has sustained me as a poet and as a writer besides living with Bob and being and thinking about I guess the vastness of poetry and how poetry can keep going for us. The first few weeks, people kept writing to us, me and Bob, and asking for us to read poems into videos or doing things, to send either videos or names of poems or send poems that would be sustaining somehow. And I thought, what the hell can poetry do? I mean, we're in this, we don't know when it's going to end. And I have to say, as the spring has progressed, even though now we're in a second outbreak and we feel baffled and terrified in some way, that the fact of the vastness of literary minds working on human suffering, and that you can open practically any book of poems. I've just been gulping poetry, and every single bit of it seems enormously useful and helpful. That people suffer together in their imaginations, and it's so sustaining. And so that has helped me. Being in interiors with paintings that I don't normally look at like 5 times, and my friend Fran Lerner, who's a brilliant artist, and we have her work all over our house, and just looking at things. So I don't know, what is sustaining you?
You, of course. I mean, we've been living and working together in the same houses for years. So in a way, that's not new, what we've been going through. One of the things, because we couldn't shop for the first weeks, we're in the demographic that's most likely to die of the virus if we get it, or I am anyway. And so we were cautious about doing things like shopping. And we had our grandchildren and then one of our children shopping for us. Now I go at senior hour and do it. But we were very preoccupied with food. We ran out of onions. How the hell do you cook anything without onions? And should we go to no, we shouldn't go to the market. So anyway, thinking about food and cooking has certainly been one of the things we did. And part of the privileged part was that the lovely restaurant in Berkeley, Chez Panisse, because they couldn't serve food, sent out an email saying, the people who supply our restaurant with produce are putting together boxes. You can come on Sunday morning and pick up boxes of produce.
So we've gotten those, and just looking in our garden, we have little greens to pick, and it sounds ridiculous, but thinking about food insecurity, if we as incredibly privileged white people who can afford, produce boxes, feel food insecurity, can you imagine? I mean, I just think of the terror and the suffering of people not able to cope. And so that has connected me with a lot of experience and connected us and our family with a lot of experience. Also, we have new grandbabies in our family, and that's been a great joy.
Pretty spectacular.
So that's
Sorry,
been,
tell a little bit of that story.
And looking at the little baby, looking at the little babies. Our 10-year-old grandson has two baby brothers. His dad has a new baby, and his mom has a new baby. My daughter, Elliot and Gabe are the two names. And we've been doing poems with Leon every day.
We do a tutorial, an hour poetry tutorial every day with our 10-year-old grandson.
So I wanted to read a poem in case Leon, it's too late for him to be watching this now, but in case he gets to see the recording later, I thought I'd read, we've been doing bird poems with him. So I thought I'd read two summer obods. It's in this book called Seasonal Works with Letters on Fire. Two summer obods after John Clare. And I should say that the anniversary of the BP oil disaster has just passed. I think it's the 10th anniversary. Two parts to this poem. Tohi, Pipolo chrysalis, wakes a human. Peep, peep, speep, beep, see peep, sheep, sheep, peep, 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 see peep, see peep, see peep, cheep, 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 cheep. A woman tosses, gulf disaster, stir, sister, aster, aster, ass, asp, peep, peep, sh, 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 peep, beep, peep, beep, peep, beep, peep, beep, peep, scream, scream, scream. We didn't need to move so fast. Two, woman in red sweater to hummingbird. S, s, we know I'm not sweet, not sweetie. I'm not something to eat.
Well, thank you for that.
Would you have a third one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a hummingbird. It certainly comes at it from a different angle. So this is it's a little prose poem, I guess. This is sort of an interesting example of doing it from the inside and doing it from the outside. This is called The Poet in the Cottage. Who is that? Her dinner guest asked. She was looking out through the French doors to the garden. Oh, the hostess said, that's the poet in the cottage. I started to rent it for a little income, but also for help with the garden. The guest looked out again at the middle-aged man with the garden hose standing on the paving stones near a bed of roses. Isn't it a little intrusive? Not at all, the hostess said. He's very quiet, no visitors. He's going through a divorce, he said, children grown, and he's moved out of his house. He only goes out for groceries, and I think he lectures once a week at the university. The guest looked again. What's he doing? Oh, the hostess said, on warm nights, he comes out and sprays water into the air to attract the neighborhood hummingbirds. We have Annas, mostly the little green ones with the ruby red heads. Mostly it's just the one, but I've seen him attract as many as 3 or 4. They just hover in the air, beating their wings while he mists them. Can't be that easy on the water bill. No, the hostess said, but it seems to give him pleasure, poor man. And the birds, of course.
We just participated in Community of Writers Week on Zoom, which we were a little bit worried about how that was going to go because it's such a pleasure to be in the mountains. And Bob wrote really wonderful pieces during the week. The staff poets are required to write every day too. And so that was one of his poems for the week. And
it was a hard week because there were like 70 of us writing, and it was incredibly interesting because of all this stuff in the world that feels like it should be addressed, and whether you should address it and how to address it. And the things you do in the world are inadequate. We've been spending our weekday evenings, maybe some of you are doing this too, addressing postcards to send to people in New Mexico and Tennessee saying, please get out and vote your neighbor, so-and-so. You know, what's a futile gesture and what isn't? And I imagine most of you also went out for some kind of walk. There were many in our little neighborhood. I mean, Berkeley, of course, is full of them, but in our little neighborhood, there was a walk organized by teenagers. And in Albany, the town next to, on the big main street, there were more than 1,000 people out. Also seemed organized probably by college kids, but by young people. And everyone was wearing their masks and everyone had their signs. And you do those things. Anyway, I found I couldn't write about that subject in any very direct way. You kind of always can.
Well, just I feel like as person who's tried to do some direct action and what would be called activism, that's directly trying to affect policy change or whatever, that you have to take your discomfort out there. And we, of course, couldn't do too much protesting with this situation, but I think what we all can do is work on our institutions to make them considerably less racially violent, the system less racially violent, and that we can work on in our wherever we are. So I also wanted to add that Meryl was asking us about whether we fear for the future. I don't know how to think about the immediate future with the pandemic. I'm worried for families with children. I'm very worried for schools. I'm, of course, terrified that the current government will stay in place. And as Bob was saying, climate change is the giant covers all of us. But I haven't felt the kind of despair because of the protests, because I feel as if finally the entire world woke up and it feels as if there's some deep systemic change for justice that's going to happen now. And that feels profound. I have a trance practice, and I talk to the sort of dead spirits that are in my life and ancestry. And my father is a constant kind of visitor in my trance practice. And I was sort of having just in touch with him the other day, and I said, what shall I say to them? What should I do? And he just said, vote. It was just this voice. It was just this little voice like, vote. Do we want to read one more poem, maybe?
Yeah.
Read one more, and then there are a few questions. So,
we'll read one of. Do you want to read one of each of?
Should we? I'll read one of Brenda's.
And I'll read one of Bob's.
So she did a series of poems about the area where we spend a lot of our time is out the Point Reyes Peninsula. It's a national seashore. Brenda wrote a wonderful sequence of poems about the national seashore. Thinking about it, thinking about a place. This poem is in 6-line stanzas, 4 6-line stanzas. They had driven to the country, though, as a poet wrote, the country will give us no peace. They took their children of light and flesh, because the sign was the sun upon the earth. It was not toxic assets. It was not forwards or options or swaps. The sign was not ruin upon the sea, for the sea saved some. A caterpillar, maybe it was a tiger moth, inched along, a few white bristles sticking up, bristles taller than the country, or Abronia latifolia's roots would not live past the country, or the blue-eyed darner and the meadowhawk with its 3 life stages. By the sea, the orb weaver repelling beside the fleabane was bolder than the country. It didn't see underlying leverage or hedging, didn't see collateralized debt obligations and rates, or see the probably 100 trillion traded on what is called futures, while the mountain lion that has a small future took her young through the O in October. Human children rolled through dune grasses. They had a simple laughter in the country. In sand, so much older than the country, they had little gladness for that day, while the sign, the shadow of death, passed over them, but death did not. Gorgeous poem.
Right.
Beautiful.
Which one do you want me to read?
I don't know. Do you want to read the...
We had a request for a poem with a cicada in it.
With the cicada in it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you know, I don't have a copy. I know what that is. It's a prose poem about Jim Tate's poem. Whoever, thank you for asking.
I'm going to read one of Bob's poems that's in a broadside, and I'm reading it. I took it down off the wall. We don't normally put our poems on a wall like this.
I never do.
But I put it on the wall, and so I confess I'm reading it behind glass here. It's from his Apple Trees at Olema, and it's from July Notebook, The Birds. And it's just such a West Marin poem that it seems right to read it right now. Late afternoons in June, the fog rides in across the ridge of pines, ghosting them and settling on the bay to give a muted gray luster to the last hours of light and take back what we didn't know at midday we'd experience as lack, the blue of summer and the gray spiced scent of the summer woods. It's as if some cold, salt god had wandered inland for a nap. You still see herons fishing in the shallows. A kingfisher or an osprey emerges for a moment out of the high, drifting mist, then vanishes again. And the soft, light green leaves of the thimbleberry and the ridged coffeeberry leaves and the needles of the redwoods and pines look more sprightly in the cool gray air with the long dusk coming on, since fog is their natural element. I had it in mind that this description of the weather would be a way to say things come and go, a way of subsuming the rhythms of arrival and departure to a sense of how brief the time is on a summer afternoon, when the sun is warm on your neck and the world might as well be a dog sleeping on the porch or a child for whom an afternoon is endless, endless. Time, thick honey, and no one saying goodbye.
I love that poem. Thanks, Brenda. So we have a question from Cynthia Randolph, which I think is a really great question, which is, how do you keep your intimacy and also keep enough solitude to be creative?
That's a good
This
question.
is that first date question that we were both I want to hear your answer.
Really, that's a very tough and kind of an intimate and strange. Well, okay, so I had an odd first marriage experience compared to Bob's. Bob reports that he used to be able to write poems at the kitchen table in his family, in which he raised his wonderful children. And I used to have not only to be in a separate room, but in a separate house to write. I would have to go to a library to write a poem. And so over the years and months of our first being together, I practiced so that I would be able to be in the same house and then one time I started writing a poem where I was actually in the same room as Bob.
This was a very slow process. Years.
It took us several years, but then finally it happened, and so now we can, at least I can be fully and happily able to write all the time if we're together. And just my writing process is so weird. Putting words from a notebook is very often what I do to make my poems. So what about you?
Well, you answered the writing part, not the intimacy part. My answer to the intimacy part is mostly, all marriages are hard as well as wonderful, and mostly we've been able to tap into it, right, in more or less ritual ways. That is, we know if we can get away together. Our experience, I think, of traveling has been pretty wonderful, mostly the shared experiences of that, and vacationing it's very rare to get her to not work for 2 or 3 days in a row, but if we could have a whole week in which we mostly hike and swim and things like that, and have evenings together, summer evenings like this together, it's very rich. But anyway, that I don't know the answer to that question of how we can summon it, but it seems like we have been able to do that. We work in different levels of the same house. We hardly pass each other during the day. We don't share work every day. I want to read you this, I want to read this. If I'm stuck with prose, I will say, will you please read this? I can't get it right. We don't do that very much with poetry until it's finished.
So are you each other's first reader?
No, I don't think so.
No. I think she's my first reader, but I'm not her first reader.
I don't know if I'm your first reader. Sometimes I'll discover a poem of Bob's that he wasn't going to even save.
Well, but then that shows you were the first reader, right?
I actually fished a poem out of the trash once. But I think that there's something about intimacy of mind and intimacy of relationship they're like a Venn diagram. There's an overlap, but they're not coterminous in that way, Yeah,
but no, they're not coterminous, and some of it has to do with getting a person.
Yeah, getting a person.
Knowing
when the person is preoccupied in a way that's productive, and you just leave them alone.
Yes, but also being moved by who they are and what their struggle is. The same things. I'm a very absent-minded person, so I'm aware that the things about me that would just not dramatic, but ordinary things that would drive people crazy, do in fact drive people crazy. And at some level, you must cut me slack because here we are.
Bob said this great thing maybe 3 or 4 years into our being together. He said, you know, people can stay in love, but or not, and that's great when they do, but the most important thing is to be able to stand each other, which was really great because I've thought of that a million times. It's really true. Like, there are a lot of people who are maybe passionately drawn together, but they can't stand each other. But you have to be able to like the person you're with as well as passionately love them in some regard, you know, in some moment. But anyway, Cynthia, I don't know if that answered your questions.
Well, maybe she'll comment. So my partner in confinement is sitting right here, and he had a question which he handed to me on this little piece of paper, which is the sales of poetry books on my website have doubled this year. This has been echoed by many from the booksellers. What do you think? Why do you think that is?
I think it's a little bit of what I was saying at the beginning. I mean, I was gulping down, like I would grab off 15 books down from a shelf, you know, Gennady Ige, Ceylon, Dickinson, you know, just C.D. Wright, so many poets that were, you know, very important to me. And I couldn't get enough of reading poetry in the first few months. You just hunger after spiritual truth when you're feeling that the world is full of suffering and unpredictability. And poets have tapped into a little bit. Maybe we are basically clueless, but we've tapped into a little bit of collective wisdom. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's partly cumulative. When I graduated from college in 1963, it was very easy to read every book of poems that was published in America because maybe there were 12, maybe 15 books. And if poets published poems every year, every 4 years, say, 4 times 15, so maybe there were 70 poets, people writing poetry in America. Now there are 300 MFA programs. Let's say there are 20 people in each program writing poems. The Poetry Foundation has, so that poetry is read on TV occasionally, and more people go to college, and that seems, you know, so, I mean, the first thing, of course, is poetry is low technology. Anybody can do it, you know, takes a pencil or a piece of paper. If you were in a Russian prison camp, you could do it with a matchstick on soap, write a poem. And so the power of expression is an incredibly important thing for people to say, I am, or this is how the world is to me. And poetry is a way to do that.
Yeah.
More and more people have access to it. And that's, I think, apart from the pressures in the world that might make self-expression precious, or articulation of grief or anger, or just I exist, important to people.
Well, that sort of leads maybe to the next and I think probably final question, because we're getting to the outside of our time range, which, and I know, Brenda, you've partially answered this already about the books that you're reading now. Who is it that you are moved to read at this moment, prose or poetry?
I am reading as many books and individual poems by BIPOC poets because I feel there are just so many fantastic things that are coming out, and you know, just Black poetry is just soaring in amazement. So I'm reading, you know, poems and books of friends, new books by friends, but also trying to catch up. We were talking at Community of Writers week about Camille Dungy's Black Nature, and I've found myself returning to the kind of intersection between the voices of Black poets writing from a very profound sense of the world and the environment, and trying to get really caught up on the poets in that anthology has occupied a lot of time for me. So that's been a really real focus of my reading. What about you, Bobby?
I've been reading Hugh Thomas's History of Slavery. The road that goes by our house here is called Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, and it leads to a beach called Drake's Beach, which is supposedly the place where Sir Francis Drake, the privateer, as he was doing a circumambulation of the group, stopped to repair his ship. There's an account of the 5 weeks that he was here. This would have been in mid-1500s, when Shakespeare was 15 years old. This guy, this pirate, beached on a California coast and described it. And when he was 18 years old, it was the very early stages of the African slave trade. And he signed on to a ship at 18 to get to go to sea. And they went to Africa and then to Portugal and sold some slaves. And there's been a proposal to rid the beach and the cove and the high school and the road of his name because he was involved in the slave trade. And I, trying to think about how to think about that, picked up a history of slavery. And which I must have read years ago. It was on my shelf, and I've my notations in it from when I was teaching. But reading it now, just to see how do you think about this and the roots of it. This is one that begins with what slavery was like in Greece and Rome. What kind of writing for me will come out of this thinking, or any? I've no idea. And then at night, for pleasure, I've been reading a novel by George Eliot, her last novel, Daniel Deronda.
What about Meryl? What have you been reading?
Well, I picked up Sarah Micklum's book because she's going to be part of the series, and I hadn't read any of her books. And it's called Fire, and it's kind of a fantasy book, and I'm completely enraptured with it. But I, like you, Brenda, I've been reading a lot of BIPOC poets and a lot of Jericho Brown, just because I had such a wonderful connection with him. And then just, online, I get a lot of poems every day of people I've never heard of. So I like to read people I've never heard of and just, kind of sample. But I think the people who I've been drawn to, the person I've been drawn to most right now is C.D. Wright for some reason. I don't know why, but
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can I put in one last plug for a really good book that I'm blown away by?
Sure.
It's a Chinese poet named Song Lin, and it's translated by our friend Jamie Xu, and it's from Zephyr Press. I'm gonna get it so that I can hold it up.
It's very exciting, the stuff that's coming out in Chinese poetry right now.
Here it is. It's really, really good, and so I wanted to put in a plug for it. It's in Chinese and English, and so it's Song Lin, Sunday Sparrows, and it's from Zephyr Press, and Jamie Proctor Zhu is
Is there time for us each to read one poem from it?
Sure.
Oh, okay.
That'll be a good ending, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll read this one because
Go away now.
I was thinking about Ross Gay when you you were talking earlier about, or we were talking about gratitude and things to be grateful for. So anyway, thank you, Meryl. This is called Gratitude. Dust hops on the ground. Trees, cars, and heads hop on the ground. A dirge hops on the ground. There is no higher object. As far as the eye can see, all that remains on the back of the mountain is one splendid building. Hearts are living inside it. Broken and mended hearts hop across the ground. Alcohol hops on the ground. Boats only pass by dead seas on their way to their home ports. People feel so paltry standing on mountaintops. They hold out their hearts like flowers and compare them. Billions of houses hop on the ground, thickly covering the planet.
I love that first line. So here's a poem very near the beginning. It's so interesting how, of course, this would have been the translator's choice, the ordering of the poems, but this is called Chrysanthemums on the Sea. Short poem, 10 lines. Sprinkle the seeds sprouted in the mirror onto the sea. Put the sword away. The sword is emanating heat in the seawater. The chrysanthemums are in bloom. The books have fallen off the shelves. 3 nightingales simultaneously fly out from the mirror. What is this that feels so frightened and shaken? Who is it on the leaking rubber boat, so frightened and shaken? My throat catches a sword falling from the sky, from the firmament. I enter the world and then sink back down, sleepwalking among mountains of immortals and the bright moon over the sea. Meryl, thank you so much.
Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you both doing this. This is really just exactly what I was hoping it would. Thanks so much.
And thanks to the audience, and keep poetry in your lives. Bye.
Okay. And I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but there were a lot. So take care. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.